Hello everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Adrian Lloyd, this is just my stupid opinion. It's nice that I can finally upload a full-length episode of the podcast. I've been so buried underneath schoolwork the last 2 weeks. Our finals were pushed back until just this past week because of the strike that happened, so I gotta tell you, I have never had so many overnighters as I have over the last 2 weeks. But the semester is done. Don't have to worry about that anymore, and I suppose none of you will have to listen to my bitching about it anymore. This will be the last time you hear me talk about it. So a lot has happened since the holidays. We're a little limited when it comes to Canadian politics because Parliament is actually out until January 29th, I believe. It's either the 28th or 29th of January. This is when they come back from their Christmas break. And they actually use this time it's very important work for them. They tend to campaign inside their ridings and go door to door, see how people think of them, what they can do for their constituents. This is because an MP doesn't have to keep the whole country happy in order to keep their job. They just have to keep their riding happy. So this is actually a very important time for them, and a lot of time when they can put in the footwork that is necessary for them in order to do their jobs properly, if they decide to do their jobs properly. But I wanted to start off today actually talking about, believe it or not, I want to talk about the Ethno-State. Because it's been talked about a lot recently. Andywarski, who many probably know, he recently stopped doing his regular videos. He said he was getting tired of doing YouTube videos, and he wanted to do something a little different. So he started up his live stream, Warski Live. And this is what he's been doing for the last few months. And not that long ago, he had Richard Spencer on with Millennial Woes, and they ended up debating against Sargon of Akkad and Styx Hexenhammer. And, of course, the topic was the Ethno-State. It was a really interesting debate. I felt that Sargon of Akkad could have done better. He came into it without taking it very seriously, something that even he seemed to admit later on after the debate. So, coming in, not taking it seriously, being a little arrogant, he didn't do the best as he could have. In fact, I've heard he's even asking for a rematch against Spencer for that very reason. He felt that because he didn't take it seriously, he can do much better in another debate. Richard Spencer, it would have been a very difficult debate to go up against Richard Spencer on this topic because this is Richard Spencer's bread and butter. He is the leader of the alt-right, so this has been his baby, this topic that he's been tweaking it, manufacturing it for about 10 years now. So he's going to have definitely heard by now a lot of criticism. He's definitely going to have thought about this ethno-state from a lot of different perspectives and coming from a lot of different directions. So it was going to be difficult going up against someone like Richard Spencer. And it was a very interesting debate. It was very, very educational. It was good to learn a little more of how the true alt-right thinks, because it's hard to understand exactly what they believe, because with the way that media is these days and the way that people are willing to propagate and slander what other people say, it's very difficult to get an honest, true opinion as to what the alt-right was unless you go to an alt-right member. I had seen Richard Spencer a few times. I never really watched his stuff. Usually it was a couple times when he was doing interviews, or in this circumstance I saw him, read up a little bit on him when I started hearing about him more and more. But I never really sat down and listened to 2-3 hours of him talking about what his ethno-state was supposed to entail. And I felt that listening to what Richard Spencer had to say on the ethno-state, I don't believe that it can be achieved the way that he is describing it. It seems to me that Richard Spencer is trying to he wants to impose an ethno-state with as much of a non-aggression policy as possible, but I don't see how you could actually do this. He talked about during this debate about paying some immigrants to go home. Like this would be a good way in order to partly in order to create your ethno-state. You could pay some of these immigrants that have come to America in order to return to their home. I think it's possible that yes, there are many that would take the money and gladly go back to their home. But there's many more who came to America because essentially they didn't want to live in their country. They wanted a better life in a better country, and that country for them was America. So that's why they showed up. You're going to have a hell of a time just dropping some cash in their hands and saying, all right, we want you to go home now, wherever you came from. For them, there's a very different reason why they're there. They're not just there because it's more prosperous, but they're there for themselves, but their future generations. They're hoping to raise their family in that country, and that their family's going to prosper inside America and just be more successful every passing decade, essentially, every passing generation. Every single one of them do a little bit better than the next. And returning to their home country is not a proposition that they're going to enjoy. Regardless, you'd have to spend a lot of money on these people in order to convince them to go home. And how many immigrants are there? Let's not even talk about illegal immigrants, but with even legal immigrants, how many are in there? Millions. So this is going to be a very expensive thing to do. This ethno-state is going to be very expensive in order to try and even deport immigrants out of this. So I don't see how just handing them a bunch of money is supposed to send them back. These individuals I'm talking about, these immigrants that came over, and a lot of these types of immigrants that we're talking about, they're the ones that want to get their citizenship. They want to become an American citizen. They love the country. They really love the country, and they want to be a citizen of it. So once again, sending them back when they have that patriotism for this country, and a lot of them, they have that patriotism because they're coming from places where they didn't have the freedoms that are available to them in America. So they love the country for that reason. A good example of this would be ex-Muslims. A lot of ex-Muslims probably came to America because they feared living in maybe Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or another Muslim country. They feared for what would happen if people found out that they had left the faith. But in America, they're free and safe to become an ex-Muslim. So trying to send these people home is going to be a problem. So what do you do? Well, when we're talking about illegal immigrants, I'm sure they would just deport them. That's it. Round them up, deport them. But then what do you do with these legal immigrants and these new citizens that are in America if they don't want to leave? Well, Richard Spencer probably would figure out some way. I'm sure he'd probably talk about how it would be. We'll probably work something out where a lot of these people can stay, because he has talked about it was either him or Millennial Woes that said you don't actually need to send everyone away. You just need to send enough of them away where essentially white people can prosper and not be bred out, I guess, is where they're coming from. But I believe in a situation like this, when you're trying to make a movement like this, there's many people who are involved, even if Richard Spencer and the more, I guess, the hierarchy of the alt-right, the leaders of the alt-right, even if they wanted to do this in a non-violent way, when you're going to then, when it's no longer theory, but you're going to put it into practice, I see that only violent outcomes can come out of this. Even when we're talking about soldiers or police officers who, if you want, are professionals at what they do. They're trained to be able for, well, military men, we're talking about, they're trained for combat. If we're talking more police, they're trained for, keeping society safe. So they are trained for some combat and some for crowd control. So these are the people that would probably be the ones responsible for rounding up these people and then getting them out, deporting them. Now, we can already have some problems when we're talking about professionals doing this. A lot of them can get out of hand and brutal things can happen. But when we're talking about numbers on such a large scale, in the millions, dozens of millions, the problem you have there is you're not going to have enough police officers in order to do this. Military, well, technically the American military is not supposed to operate in that manner on American soil. So that would be a big violation of laws, treaties, constitutional rights. So you would have to pull a lot of nasty shit, like a lot of breaches of ethics and morals and laws in order to pull this off. You also probably do not have enough people to really round everybody up. So you're probably going to need some assistance from local population. I mean, you can have all the soldiers and all of the police officers at your command, but it's still going to be difficult. You're going to need people inside the communities that know a little bit more, that are willing to help out, which will probably lead to some sort of civilian police force in some way, or them hiring on militias in order to help them out and round up illegal citizens or people that they want deported from their ethno-state. When we're talking about civilians getting this much power, this is where mob mentality takes over. And a lot of times, this is where things such as mass killings can happen, or tortures, just as an example. So I don't see how we'd be able to accomplish this with a more non-violent approach. Maybe you could start off with a non-violent approach, but I guess I'm using sort of the snowball rolling down the hill example. You can start off small, doing things like, well, we'll pay you to go home. But as you get more resistance, people are not going to want to leave, people are going to resist you, people are going to fight you, which is going to lead to violence. And that's going to require governmental force, governmental violence, in order to retaliate. So really, I just see this as leading to clashes on the streets. Not to mention that many of these minority groups that feel like they're being persecuted, having the government come after them, having society come after them to send them away, rebel groups are probably going to pop up everywhere. And then if that's happening, we're having civilian militias fighting small rebel groups throughout America. So this is where I think a civil war could happen. Because on top of this, again, you're violating a lot of constitutional rights, you're violating a lot of laws, you're violating a lot of American policies. You're going to have patriotic Americans who love their America the way it is, that are not going to enjoy seeing citizens, even if it is illegal citizens, or just the violence that's happening, that's coming from the government in general. They're not going to like this. And they themselves will probably rise in revolt. Many of them will probably rise in revolt, maybe not as to defend the minority groups, but more out because they're scared, because they'll probably see this and think, how long till the government comes after me? This is the other thing that ends up happening. While you might start out this way, trying to go after obvious minorities such as Latinos, you might be trying to go after Muslims, yada, yada, yada. Well, I feel in this situation, once you've more or less achieved your ethno-state, very similar to the far left, you're going to need your next victim, which means probably people are not going to be white enough. We'll probably go back and hear about things like Italians are no longer white people. Or perhaps we'll hear something, but just any of the other ones. I believe this is probably where it moved to, because it sounds like in this situation with the alt-right, they always need to have a victim. Or they I guess not a victim for them, they need to have an enemy to fight against. Otherwise, once you've achieved your ethno-state, the governmental power, the amount of power you've achieved, pretty much becomes redundant. You don't need it anymore. And are we expecting this hierarchical society to then hand that power down back to the people? Because even though Richard Spencer talks about hierarchies, it sounds like he still wants to do it in a relatively democratic way. I don't know how he plans to do this, because at the same time, he seemed to not take the Constitution very seriously. And he said things like, do you really think a piece of paper is supposed to protect you? Well, Yes and no. It's not so much that the piece of paper or the words written on it are really going to protect you. It has more to do with that it forms a basis, if you want. It forms a base, It forms a base, an objective code that needs to be respected by government, by courts, just for every single one of us. So even though, yes, the Constitution will get violated time and time again by government, it is a form of protection for people. Because at the very least, it lets us know when the government's stepping over the line. Because we know through the Constitution, or I guess Americans, I am Canadian, so it doesn't really apply to me in that, but the Canadian Constitution would in this regard. We know when the government steps over the line because it's written down on that piece of paper that Richard Spencer doesn't seem to take very seriously. And also, I guess the ironic thing about this is, even though Richard Spencer is he's kind of spitting on the Constitution, maybe not totally, but in some regard he is spitting on the Constitution. The Constitution is in place to keep us safe from the type of power that Richard Spencer is talking about. This exact form of authoritarian government that Richard Spencer wants to introduce is why the Constitution was put in place. This is exactly what the American founding fathers were trying to prevent. This was sort of not quite to the extent, maybe, but this was the authoritarian government that they were running from the British at the time. This was what they were fighting to get away from. They found it too authoritarian. It didn't take into regards its citizens, and in their case, the colonists. So this is why they rebelled and installed the Constitution. So that's where I find it's a little bit ironic. Maybe Richard Spencer realized that, maybe he doesn't. The other thing, too, we really have to take into consideration, which is true in both political theory and if you're looking at it historically, is that it's very difficult to install a new government system on top of an old government system, one that's already in place. This is actually one of the reasons that while some Canadians want to move to a more American system, for instance, maybe a more American type of voting where we have more direct line to who we vote for. In Canada, the way we vote right now is we have all our individual MPs in our riding. They're in our riding. We vote for our individual municipal MP who's in our riding. And if that MP gets in, it goes in. So, for instance, if you vote for, say, the Liberal candidate, and the Liberal candidate in your riding gets in, that goes into the bigger vote as to who gets to be Prime Minister. So that's how you end up winning. You don't win necessarily. You don't vote directly for the Prime Minister. In 2015, this is more for the Americans than the Canadians. The Canadians know this. But for any Americans watching, in 2015, when Justin Trudeau was on the ballot, was running for Prime Minister, when I went to the polls, I didn't have Justin Trudeau on my ballot. I had my individual MP for my riding. I had to vote for them, and that's how it works. That's how a Canadian Prime Minister gets into power. So and another thing that's actually kind of interesting is, while a Canadian Prime Minister can get into power, they can actually be removed by the party themselves. They're just the leader of the party, and the party itself is what wins the election. So if the party itself voted amongst itself to remove the Prime Minister and install someone else, that's exactly what they could do. Just we, the individual citizens, can't do that. We can only do that through election. So anyway, getting back on topic, though, that was a little off topic. But getting back on topic, the problem when you're trying to install a new system on top of an old system, there's a few different reasons for it. But on top of it being a governmental political system, it's also for a lot of people a way of life. This affects the way that we go about our day-to-day lives because certain things become confusing underneath a new regime, especially when it comes in so quickly and just pretty much just crushes the old one underneath it. The problem is there's a lot of confusion among certain things, such as laws. Certain things suddenly are legal, certain things are illegal. Things you've grown accustomed to and were allowed to do your whole life suddenly become taboo. Just for an example, things that you always thought could never be acceptable were suddenly are. So these are one of the reasons why people get confused with the new political system a lot of times. It's not just about the laws, but they're not necessarily sure how it works. They're not necessarily sure how the power structure works. And until it's put into play, a lot of people can worry about that. A lot of people can be worried that the new structure will actually cause more centralized power to an individual or an organization, a group, and people can actually lose their standard of living. So these are some of the reasons why it's very difficult to put a new system on top of an old one, and why a lot of times historically when you do this, the society of this new system collapses eventually. Might take some time, but it will happen. And the thing is too, is the alt-right more or less has admitted, while they want to go about it with as much of a non-violent policy as possible, they do at least acknowledge that something like this, a dramatic change like this, would probably lead to violence. I think it's pretty obvious if you look at what they want to do that it would lead to violence and the use of force. But the other thing about the alt-right and Richard Spencer is he's against, he's pretty much against individualism, or not necessarily against it, I should say, but he sees it as more overrated, as that the liberals who preach individualism, the problem is that while the rest of us are practicing individualism, that there are people out there that are amassing force through community and are prepared to use force and violence essentially against those individuals. He also was making the argument about people who give up their individual rights for the community willingly, such as when we go to work and things like this. There's no denying it that, yes, absolutely, we need to keep, there is community, but the problem is when it's all about collective, all about community. It has to be about the individual. And you need, at least in my opinion, you need a society based on individuals, even though I find they'll will a lot of times lead to more conflict, inner conflict, because people don't necessarily get along. You lose a lot more when everything becomes about the collective. When the collective is more important, which it seems that Richard Spencer is really trying to enforce. When the collective is more important than the individual, then the individual doesn't matter. So your life, my life, what we do with it, it doesn't matter as long as we're improving the community. If we look at how places like Russia during World War II, how they conducted themselves and how they conducted themselves for their soldiers. If anybody have seen the movie Enemy at the Gates, this is about the Battle of Stalingrad. It was a great movie. It was about two snipers, a Russian sniper and a German sniper facing off throughout the battle. And anyway, one thing in the beginning of the movie is the Russian soldiers they rush the Germans in their position, but they're getting slaughtered, so they retreat. And their commanders who are back in the line tell them, stop, turn around, fight. And when they won't, they gun them down themselves. They pretty much say, no retreat. The point of this was because everything was about Mother Russia. Everything was about the country. Everything was about doing it for your leader, such as Stalin, who was leader at the time. And so your individual life didn't matter. It didn't matter if you ran into that battle and got slaughtered. They didn't care how scared you were, because you were supposed to sacrifice your life for Mother Russia, so that way the country, the collective, can progress. And this is also why we saw plenty of slaughtering and plenty of violation of just human rights during the Soviets' time in power, and other collective groups such as communist groups that are in power. This is why we are against them. And it just seems like Richard Spencer, for the most part, he's not he's not trying to bring in communism as in like, oh, we need to spread the wealth or anything like that, and it's all about equality. But it was all about, communism was all about the collective. Same with the Nazis, from the German Nazis. It was all about the collective. The individual didn't matter. Old Germany was like this too before the rise of the Nazi Party. Even during World War I, people were being encouraged to go and fight for Germany, for the honor of Germany. And again, it didn't really matter. Your individual life, your individual experience, it didn't matter. So if you got killed, as long as you got killed furthering the cause of your country, of the collective, then your death was perfectly acceptable. This is why I'm really against how much collectivism comes out of the alt-right, how much how much of it is about the power, about the collective. For me, I would really start getting worried when Richard Spencer or any of the alt-right were to start talking about the homeland. If they were to say, we need to do it for the homeland. Because now we're getting dangerously close to for the motherland, for the fatherland. Exactly how the Soviets and the Germans used to, or the Soviets and the Nazis used to refer to their countries. If they were to say that, then it's pretty much official that if the ethno-state come in, then it's all about the homeland. Your individual rights don't matter. It's all about the collective. It's all about the ethno-state. I don't see much of a difference when I look towards the far left and then the alt-right, because it seems that both sides want authoritarian for different means. In this ethno-state, which seems to be mostly about hierarchy, one thing that I really like that Sargon of Akkad asked Richard Spencer, which I think that one of the moderators, JF, ended up saying was kind of a straw man argument. I don't know. I think it's a valid question, is that whether Richard Spencer would be happy as a serf in his newfound ethno-state. And essentially, it's because, without a doubt, as the leader of the alt-right, Richard Spencer Chasm sees himself at the top. In the ethno-state, he would essentially be the president, as most people would see themselves. Most people don't put ideas forward like this. And they're like, yeah, I'm just, a regular Joe living next to you, though. After all this, I'll let somebody else handle all the power and everything. That's not the way Lenin did it. When Lenin did the October Revolution, it's not like after they accomplished and got into power, they said, all right, let's let somebody else handle this. No, he immediately took over for power. So this is why he asked Richard Spencer this, because Richard Spencer sees himself at the top of the hierarchy. So how is life supposed to be for the average Joe? Which to them they seem to see as, well, it's pretty average day to day, but is it really average day to day? It seems that in a situation like this, criticizing the ethno-state would probably be seen as going against the homeland. Even though, again, Richard Spencer hasn't said anything about the homeland, I'm just saying that if this was a possibility. But if we're talking about collective groups, if you're going against the collective, then you're a problem that needs to be dealt with. You cannot have dissent. Everybody needs to be on the same page. I think a good example for this would be people who've seen the Lego movie. I think that's perfect, because in the Lego movie at the beginning, it's just the average Joe going around. Everything is awesome, and then he meets up with this group of builders who can just are against the status quo, and they're the worst people. They're being hunted by the government forces. This is pretty much the same story amongst any sort of dystopian future. It's that this collectiveness where everybody is forced to think the same and act the same, and this is exactly how it sounds in the ethno-state. I mean, if you're in the ethno-state, can you really be more about multiculturalism, for example, if that happens to be where you lean more? Probably not. Multiculturalism would probably be one of those things that are banned. Even Richard Spencer himself has said that free speech absolutism is stupid. That, yeah, you need free speech, but then you need to have limitations on it. Well, this is why people who are free speech absolutists are free speech absolutists, because where does it stop? Where does it stop? Bill C-16 is a good example of this in Canada, the transgender rights, where it put it in the Criminal Code of Canada that, at least in official business, you're not allowed to misgender somebody. But then at the same time, how many genders do we have? So how far does that go? This is exactly the same problem, and we've seen some problems from Bill C-16 in this exact regard. People who it said it's not going to target, it has targeted them. So if you're putting in not even necessarily something like that, but you're putting in something more like, well, we don't like criticisms against the ethno-state. Even if it's something more of like, well, you can criticize them in your own time when you're behind in private, but you can't go out in public and criticize them. Well, then I couldn't be sitting here right now doing my podcast, because a lot of my podcast has been based on criticizing the government, the Canadian government, but mostly that's what I do in here. So, like, people really shouldn't expect the podcast to change too much if a conservative or another government got in, because that's what I do. I criticize the people in power. But I couldn't do that in an Ethno-State. This podcast, I couldn't sit here and do this, because this would be considered dissent. And if an Ethno-State came in, I absolutely would be criticizing it, because there are things I wouldn't like. There's things I don't like about every government. Even if there's things they do well, there's things I don't like. We can lose freedoms such as this, and we don't even realize it. It's not much difference to the censorship that the far left wants. So even though some people have talked about how horseshoe theory is bullshit and that they can disprove it, it seems to be that there's still a lot of merit to horseshoe theory. But if the ethno-state did come into play in Canada, this would actually not be a good thing for the Canadians. For a simple reason is, if we look back on 2017, as Donald Trump came into office, and then he threatened certain things such as ending DACA, taking away temporary protective statuses from like the Haitians, and I think El Salvadorians as well. The Salvadorians, I think, is the other one he's taken away from. As this is happening, we saw a huge influx of illegal migrants into Canada, and this has caused problems for us, because they come in and we're not sending them back, even though by rights what we should do, especially underneath the treaty that we have with America, which states that any refugee that comes in North America has to file, or at least between Canada and America, has to file refugee status with the first safe country that they arrive in. So if it's America, then that's where you file refugee status. You can't move to Canada and file refugee status. This is exactly what is going on. This caused a lot of problems because we need to house them. We need to feed them. We can't just let them die on our doorsteps. We can't just let them freeze in the middle of winter. So we're housing them. We have pretty much looks to be a refugee camp / slum that was down by that crossing, because people were staying in tents because we didn't have a place to house them. We were housing them in the old Montreal Olympic Stadium, that crumbling piece of shit, which pretty much created another sort of slum right inside that stadium. And then they all needed to be on government assistance because they didn't have jobs. They're illegal crossings, so they don't have jobs. And in order to be able to buy their own food, they need money. So government is the one paying for them. Excuse me. Better. Sorry. Small burp. So if all of a sudden America's not just ending certain programs of refugees, but suddenly they're ending all the programs and sending all the immigrants back, well, then we're just going to see one long dash for the Canadian border. And there's not much we could do about it because Canada has the longest undefended border in the world. Right now, we would face, I guess, in that situation, a similar situation that would have been faced by the ancient Chinese, which is that they have this huge border so long and they don't have the troops to defend it. When they built the Great Wall of China, the Chinese really only had one soldier per so many meters of the border wall. So it really couldn't be defended that well. This is very similar. Canada has virtually no navy. We rely on the Americans to defend us from sea. So we have no navy. We have border guards, but again, we have so few of them, and our border is so long that there's so many crossings that anybody could get in from almost any point, and there's almost nothing we could do about it. So in this situation, we would have a lot more people coming in who would need to be housed. We'd have to find some way to house them. And if they came in and they weren't underneath government assistance, then they'd probably be on the streets because, again, they have no money, they have no job, they can't apply for a job because they don't have a visa or citizenship. So then what are they supposed to do? We're going to have a huge clash of cultures because we're just going to all of a sudden have a large group of migrants showing up. And if anything, this would actually probably lead to the rise of some sort of ethno-state in Canada. Because once we have just swarms of people that were coming across the American border, suddenly people would kind of look down at what America is doing and be like, shit, maybe we need to do that here. So I do think that would extend to Canada. So it would have bad effects for Canadians. It would lead us to, it would essentially, I think, destroy our country the same way it would destroy America. Everything that we are, we'd either be forced to change in one of two ways. Either we would have to be forced to adopt the ethno-state and become part of the ethno-state, which probably means in a situation like that Canada and America would amalgamate into one large country. And many people have actually theorized that would happen one day. I don't know, but if the ethno-state did happen and we in Canada adopted it, that is probably what would happen, I would assume. Or Canada would have a completely new change in population and demographics. Because we'd have a bunch of people, all these people that would have crossed over, they would have been running because they're not essentially white immigrants. So they can't stay in America, they come to Canada. So suddenly we have millions of people crossing into Canada. We also see when this happens, there's a clash of cultures. That when suddenly when this happened in places like Germany, people they weren't getting along. They were battling it out. They just couldn't adapt to one another. So Canada would be changed forever in one of those two ways. So I don't really want to live in the ethno-state because I don't see achieving the ethno-state without a very authoritarian government, which would lead, in my opinion, to dictatorship. And that's not a world I'm interested in living in, underneath a dictatorship. I like living in a more free, independent world. But there's a few things that need to at least be addressed, such as it's pretty much undeniable that as far as population and birth rates go, it's almost undeniable that one day over the next few hundred years, white people will be gone. There'll be so few of us that one day there won't be any more white people. So this is one thing that's led to the rise of the alt-right and the talks about the ethno-state and why stuff like race realism is starting to become more mainstream. It has to do, I think, with a lot of people starting to realize this, and at least it's fear. In some sense, it's fear of being essentially wiped out. For a lot of people that are on the alt-right, they don't want to see white people wiped out because, for them, being white is their culture. So this is why they've adopted the alt-right. This is why they've adopted the ethno-state. So maybe that's worth a conversation of maybe tightening up immigration or something along those lines, but to actually forcefully force out anybody that would be non-white, essentially, I cannot see that ending well for anybody, even the rest of us, like somebody like me. This wouldn't affect me. I'm white. This wouldn't affect me. I'm Scottish. Like, well, my roots are Scottish. So I wouldn't have to fear anything from the ethno-state, them coming after me. Neither would my family. But this would limit the rest of us, even if we didn't suffer the same way at the hands as others would. This would limit us. Like, what our freedoms are. Not to mention that there's generations of people who have lived here, There's some people who have lived here for 100 years, even though maybe they're Chinese, maybe they're black or something. So where would they go back to? Sure, maybe their roots are, let's take Chinese. Their roots are in China, but their family hasn't lived in China since their great grandfather or something like that. They're going to go back to China? I don't see how something like that's going to work. The other thing is too, is at least in some regards, there are some alarming things with the alt-right. So, for instance, in another stream, not the one that was Richard Spencer versus Sargon of Akkad, what ended up happening was they were debating. It was an alt-right and an Antifa member, and they also brought on a liberal centrist, just to be sort of, literally the one in the middle. It was pretty much between alt-right and Antifa member. But the alt-right member, I cannot remember his name right now. He was refusing essentially to disavow what they called the 14 words, and this is comes from a chapter. I can't remember which chapter, but it's a chapter from Mein Kampf, which it's called the 14 words, which is part of the bigger what they call the 88. And that's because this chapter had 88 words. These 14 words were in there, and essentially said something along the lines of, we need to secure the future for the white race, or something almost that. And he didn't want to disavow those 14, and I can't really remember if he was not willing to disavow the 88 either, but at least those 14 words he was not willing to disavow. It doesn't look good when you're not willing to disavow something Hitler said. But I don't think for him, it's not that he liked Hitler or respected Hitler or something, or wanted to follow some of Hitler's teaching. It was more that even though Hitler was a terrible person, for him, that was at least a passage that he felt he could agree with, even if he didn't agree with Hitler's means. That's the way I'm perceiving from the way he went about it. It's not that he was saying, we like the Nazis, or I am a Nazi and I liked Hitler. It was that he was saying, more that I don't like Hitler. I don't like what Hitler did, but I do agree that when he said we need to secure the future for the white race, at least from what I took out of it, from what he said. Even if you agree with it, disavow it. Just say, I disavow this person and what they've done and everything, but at least along these lines, I think they may have had a point. Just one man's stupid opinion, though. So, after the debate between Sargon of Akkad and Richard Spencer, Sargon of Akkad went back and, he thought about it. He talked to a few people. He did a live stream where he spoke to some people about the debate and about what went on. And there was some criticism of him, of how he conducted himself. He ended up putting out it was around a 5-minute video about what to do. I think it was called What to Do in 2018. And essentially, he was talking about, I guess in a way, maybe some stuff that Richard Spencer did get to him. Because he started up what he called Liberalist. And I guess it's more about what I was just talking about a little while ago, about sort of how the collective is important, but it has to be made up of individuals, and this is what he's trying to do. Essentially, a collective group made up of individual-minded people that are essentially looking to spread the core message of liberalism. So he was saying, we'll call ourselves Liberalist. So maybe something that was said by Richard Spencer did resonate with him. Maybe it was that whole, even if you're not prepared to use power, there are others that will. So Sargon, I believe what he's trying to do is start up a group that essentially would be willing to play this game, but essentially play it in a safer, more ethical way, I think, is what he's trying to do. But here's where I have criticism of the Liberalist group. When I first watched the video, the very first time, I was kind of like, Liberalist, okay, yeah. I kind of thought about it a little bit more, and then a few things started to get to me about it. One of the main things was, where he came up with Liberalist and what he did to justify the name of the group is he's talking about how other groups that push their core messages, essentially, they're trying to, essentially more like activist groups, and essentially says, so if somebody who preaches fascism is a fascist, somebody who preaches feminism is a feminist, someone who preaches communism is a communist, and I think he may use a couple more, is someone who preaches Islam is an Islamist, then maybe if you were to do that with liberal, we should be liberalists. My problem with this, number one, is, well, these other terms that he used to justify it are not good terms. I mean, when he made the reference, for instance, say he said those who preach feminism is feminist, for instance, he's obviously making reference to third wave modern day feminists, the ones that are just off the fucking wall, that everybody can't stand. Those are the sort of feminists he's talking about, and it's pretty clear also from the other choices that he chose, such as fascist, Islamist. So he got the name of it from these groups, yet these are not good groups. These are not good necessarily groups you want to be associated with. You really shouldn't, especially as more of a liberal, individual-minded person. You shouldn't be associated with this. So I'm wondering, it makes me nervous that Liberalist is going to turn into sort of the new feminist, if you want. It's going to start off as this, but then it's going to go way too far, and it's going to have to start getting called out. So I believe he started with good intentions, but I think calling it a new name, creating something like Liberalist, was a problem. I think it's going to cause more harm than good. I think if he just made a general call for liberals and more of those like-minded individualists to come together and as a group to focus their attention and their activists in this way, it would work out a little better, because these are also the type of liberals he's calling are not like the social justice warrior type liberals. He's talking about the good liberals, the ones that are true liberals to this day. Those are the sort of people that he's making the call out to. But I fear in doing this, we're going to get caught up in, this liberalist group is going to get caught up in the same problems that all these other groups get caught up in. And it's just that. It's about the collective. A good example is Margaret Atwood, who is a well-known feminist who has been critical of the Me Too movement recently, and she's being called a bad feminist because of it. This woman is probably one of the core feminists. Many of these modern-day feminists grew up probably reading her work, and then, of course, taking it way out of context and going way too far with it, because Margaret Atwood would be, I would say, a true feminist, a good feminist. But she went against the status quo of what is feminism right now. And because of that, she's being disowned by the group, being called things such as a bad feminist. So I fear that this is the same sort of trap that Liberalist is going to fall into. It's not going to be about liberalism. It's going to be about Liberalist. And then we're going to see essentially a new form of social justice warriors, or along those lines, because even if you don't want to call a lot of people on the far right social justice warriors, they can fall into the same traps as the social justice warriors, as the SJWs. So if you're not going to call them that, you need to call them something else along those lines. And I fear that this is the sort of thing that's going to brew out of Liberalist. We're just going to see another one of these fanatical groups that it's all about the core identity and it's all about you following what they believe to the letter, and that trailing from this is going to be social suicide, essentially. A lot of the ways it is today for other groups such as progressivism, the progressives out there. I believe Liberalist is going to fall into this trap. And the other thing is, if this it does happen, which, again, I really do think it will, if this happens, then it's just another way that I find true liberals, the people who really do subscribe to what I think is a very good core political philosophy that should, in many ways, even if not the whole thing, but a lot of true liberalism should be incorporated into other political structures when they're being formed. It's just going to, I think, slander it and pull it through the mud more. Because we already have a group of people out there that call themselves liberals that are they're not liberals. They'll gladly throw themselves under the blanket of liberals, but they see a big problem with liberals. I mean, the far left, like the more Antifa and radical left, they've posted plenty of times in the past things like liberals get the bullet too. But even progressives are willing to call themselves liberals, but then they'll distance themselves from actual liberalism. Like, not follow the core identity, be like, oh, we're liberals, you know, we believe in this. It's like, no, you're a progressive, you believe in something completely different. We actually don't agree on a lot of issues. So liberalist will just be another form of progressivism. It's going to be the same thing. We're liberals, but you're going to actually commit a lot of illiberal acts during the process. I have a feeling, though, that this will not be led by Sargon of Akkad. What's going to end up happening is Sargon of Akkad has started up Liberalist. And he's going to try and bring under this flag, and I think he's actually going to run it pretty damn well. I think he's going to run it pretty damn well off the start. It's going to get out of control. I think what's going to happen is very similar to what some people did in the alt-right. Maybe someone like Milo or Lord Southern, and even I think Gavin McInnes might fall underneath this category of they were originally identifying as alt-right, but then they left that they stopped calling themselves that once certain things happened in the alt-right, when they saw like maybe it was becoming very anti-Semitic or there was a racist section and it started growing. That's when they were more like, okay, getting out of there, and no, we're alt-lights now. So I think it's going to be a very similar grooming process. I think because Sargon of Akkad is pretty big, you know, he's got something like almost 750,000, like 750,000 subscribers or something. He's huge these days. We will catch on. A lot of people will start calling him liberalist. But I think it's going to morph into something that Sargon of Akkad is not expecting. He's going to try and rein it in for a while, but then he's going to see where it got out of control. He could see how it's not the group, that it hasn't gone the way that he had planned, and he's going to get out. And he won't associate with it, because I think Sargon is smart enough that he will not be associated with a group that turned violent or more turned into an SJW wing. I think he would get out of it. The thing is, though, is if it does bring about some sort of new form of social justice warrior, it's probably, the fear is too, this is rising from the center. So now we have the same problems that for a long time Sargon has railed against, and one thing the centrists have been good to avoid, and is falling into the trap of going against someone's freedom, virtue signaling, which a lot of people can these days. We can all be guilty of it, but this would rise in the center. So suddenly it seems we have a third group rising up of these crazy radicals who, like, radical collectivists. And now we have one on the left, one on the right, and one smack dab in the center. It's possible if this was to happen, we would actually have created and gave rise to a whole new form of political interaction. Because if we have these three-sided radicals just going at each other, who knows what that can turn into. So I understand what Sargon was trying to do. I really do. I respect him for trying. I think he could have done it a better way. I think when he went... The problem really is, I think the fact that he just called it Liberalist is that he's now giving it a name. He's now giving it a collective umbrella. The exact problem we were trying to avoid. Instead of pulling all the individual like-minded people together, instead I believe he's created another sort of radical... He's created a radical centrist group, essentially. Not yet, but it'll grow into that. So I actually spoke a little bit longer about the Sargon debate and the Ethno-State than I meant to. I meant to just cover it briefly, but I guess I had a lot more to say. There are a few updates, at least in terms of what's going on here in Canada. And one of them is actually a little gross. It seems that right now there is a two-week tour going around. It might actually be concluding very soon. But St.Francis Xavier's almost 500-year-old arm is making its way across Canada through various churches in different cities for, well, Catholics to go and, inspect it, touch it. Of course, not directly. It has a glass display. Here's a picture for you. Yeah, it's gross. It's really gross. But St. Francis is pretty well known in the religion. He was very famous for... actually, he was one of the main... after the Reformation of the Protestant Church and then the Counter-Reformation from the Catholic Church, which he was a counter-reformer, he ended up going east, actually, and he brought Catholicism to a lot of the cultures out in the east right now, such as in India and parts of Japan. So that's why he's very well known, and actually a lot of the people who are going to be going out to see this arm is people from those cultures, such as Catholic Indians, for instance, because a lot of them, they would attribute St. Francis as being the one who baptized their ancestors, because he was the one who started it up in there. It's worth at least noting that St. Francis, for his name, may not be necessarily... It's worth he's not the guy that everybody thinks he was, because he was responsible for bringing part of the Portuguese Inquisition over to India, because where he was campaigning was part of the Portuguese Empire at the time. So he really did not view the Indian people or the Indian culture or religion very highly. Apparently he used to call them Negroes. So he felt that an Inquisition was necessary. And he was the one who brought in the Goa in Inquisition. So he has a pretty nasty history behind him. But this is where, when I first saw this just reminded me of a line that Christopher Hitchens said in one of his debates about secularism versus religion.
Divine permission given to people who think they have God on their side enables actions that a normal, morally normal unbeliever would not contemplate.
I really cannot picture a atheist or a secularist would actually be happy and be willing to go out to see the severed and rotting arm of someone like Christopher Hitchens or somebody like that. I highly doubt that you could find somebody that would go to that, because why? What would be the point? Why would I want to see Christopher Hitchens' severed arm that's rotting in a display case? Can't you let the guy, rest in peace in the ground where he's disintegrating, because, no heaven for him? I love Christopher Hitchens, clearly, considering how I have a segment called The Hitch Slap. But if I can give a piece of advice to Christians out there, stop it. Stop it right now. Because the one thing that a lot of Christians like to pull over Islam is they say Islam is barbaric and it's a cult and it's a religion that's 400 or 500 years behind the rest of the religions in the world, like Christianity and Judaism. This does not help that argument. When you have somebody's severed arm going around, it really makes it look bad. Although I would like to point out this is coming from Catholicism, so it doesn't really surprise me that they would go more along those directions, the Catholics. But this is gross. And some of the comparisons just should not be made that are using, because one person that was going to see it, her name was Angèle Regnier. She said, she ended up saying, "We admire him. He's our hero. It's like having the Stanley Cup come to your tournament. He's so cool, so identifiable." That's not a good comparison when you really think about it, because then something like this happens. Or something like this happens. You see, it gets weird. It gets weird. I point in the wrong direction because the camera is mirrored to me. But it gets weird, you see. Suddenly you go from licking the Stanley Cup, you're licking a severed arm. Why not a relic? Like, I know to them their arm is a relic, but why not a relic such as an object, something that of St.Francis's that he owned, and not bring that around? Why would you choose to send his arm around? Now the point is, it's actually pretty obvious why they would, because he was the right arm was very famous, because that was what they said they baptized the whole Eastern culture. So it's very famous for that regard. But it's nearly 500 years old. It's disgusting. Now, the thing is, too, is one of the reasons I think they took it is because people said that what happened with St. Francis's body is shows his divinity, but it was because when St. Francis died, he got buried, and then later on his body got dug up, and then it was brought to stay at the Church of St. Paul, I believe. I'm just going to find that right now. I believe it was the Church of St. Paul. But, yeah, it was... the one thing about him was the fact that he did not have... His body hadn't... Yeah, it was moved in 1553 to St. Paul's Church. So this was a few months after he died. But it was the fact that they said his body was not decomposing. It was not the proper way. So this shows his divinity. I don't agree with this for a few reasons, because there are some natural ways for a body to be preserved, and that doesn't show divinity just because his body didn't decompose properly. Well, first off, it takes something like 8 to 12 years for a body to fully decompose. And people were even though it took them a little bit longer, one thing that it's where you're buried can matter, or where your body is can matter, because if it's frozen, that can preserve your body from disintegrating, decomposing. A bog actually will preserve a body. We've pulled many bodies out of old bogs before that are actually pretty well intact. And then sand, actually. And St. Francis was buried on a beach. That's where he resided at first, for the first few months at the very least, before he was dug back up and brought out. I think what ended up happening is the sand helped preserve it for a while, and then on top of that, he was moved to a tomb. That's where he resided. He in St. Paul's Church. He was moved to a tomb. Tombs have been known to hold to stop bodies from decomposing properly. Sometimes that one is a little more specific. You need more specific conditions for that. It's not just you build a tomb, put a body in, it'll preserve it sort of thing. It needs certain conditions. There's also artificial ways to keep a body alive. You can cover it in honey. This is an old form of embalming, for instance. Although they're claiming by a professional that no embalming was involved. I don't know if I necessarily trust that, because this would have been back at best at about 1600. And it's not like the church was necessarily best with their scientific method at that time. So I'm going to have reservations on how that happened. But I find that there's a lot more, it's much more possible, a lot more natural ways that the body was preserved than the fact that it was his divinity. And I really think most of what it came from his divinity is just for the fact that he is a saint. It's just the fact that they do hold this religious beliefs, and it's the fact that, oh, his body didn't decompose. Well, that must be because God is preventing it. It shows his divinity because it doesn't decompose properly. No, it doesn't. That doesn't prove his divinity. It just proved that his body did not decompose properly. That's really all you've proven. But St. Francis is important for the Catholics, especially Eastern Catholics. They see him as being the founder of their religion, and this arm's going to go around different churches in Canada. Jesus Christ. Once again, as Hitchens said, religious people will do things that secularists would not contemplate. We would not dig up a corpse and send it around for this reason. Although it's not a corpse, I know it's an arm. But we wouldn't dig up a limb and do this. We wouldn't do this with Christopher Hitchens. We wouldn't do this with any of the other well-known atheists after they died, just because of this. So I just think the whole thing is gross. I think it's unnecessary, and I think they need to stop it right now.
Pastors, are you ready? You want something? Take it! That's yours tonight. You want it? You want it? Take it! You want it tonight? Take it! The power of the Holy Ghost! Take it! Oh, take it! Take it! Take it! And the power of the Holy Ghost! The anointing of the Holy Ghost! You want it? You want it? Take it! That's the power of the Holy Ghost! You want it tonight? You want it? Take it! That's the power of the Holy Ghost!
Alright, but now moving on to something a little bit different. We're just going to pound through real quickly a few stories. Before the holidays, on the 20th of December, we got the Trudeau report from the Ethics Commissioner, Mary Dawson. She since then has she's no longer the Ethics Commissioner because her term was up in I believe it was the 1st of January 2018. But since then, we got this report saying that Trudeau violated section of the members' code of ethics. He violated sections 5, sections 11, section 12, and section 21, all because he took a private trip from the Akkad the year before around the Christmas holidays. And she said that the fact that Akkad and him had been friends for a long time, well, not friends for a long time. They know their families know each other a long time, but then there was a 30-year gap and their contact only came back in on a steady pace after Trudeau became Liberal leader. That there seemed to be there was a conflict of interest, because the other thing is in Canadian law, at least for the parliamentarians, that the the code works that it's all about appearances. If it looks like it can be a conflict of interest, if it can be perceived as that by others, then it's considered a violation of the code. And this, to a lot of people, seemed to be a violation. Then nothing happened. Trudeau gave a BS apology on the matter. He whined about having to stay in. Canada during the Christmas break, and nothing ended up happening. In fact, right now Trudeau's going across different areas. He's going across different cities doing town halls. However, what I really think this is damage control, because the areas he's going seem to be, a lot of them are in where the ridings would be important, such as more in the Grand Toronto area. So I think it's really damage control. He's going back to where because his polls are dropping. That's also been something that's been coming out recently. We're finding his popularity is dropping. So I think this is all damage control. These town halls allow people to yell it out and then speak some nice words, and then try and get some support back, because now it's not looking good. But nothing has happened with this. No one's really demanded much out of him. Many people have said, oh, well, he's apologized. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that this would not be accepted by many other, if this had happened under many other prime ministers, especially if this was Harper. Yet people are really not willing to charge Trudeau with anything. They're not willing to fine Trudeau with anything. They're not, even Mary Dawson, she said that as punishment, the press, his bad publicity over the last year is punishment enough. No, it isn't. Not when the first prime minister in history violates an ethics code. So nothing's being done. And even, recently, this past week, there was the Parliament, the Ethics Committee, which is Liberal dominated. They had a motion put forward by the Conservative Peter Kent. He ended up requesting. He put a motion forward saying that Justin Trudeau should speak to the Ethics Committee, and they should be allowed to ask them questions. And then this happened.
On the motion, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
No.
Mr. Saini.
No.
Mr. Fergus.
Je vote non.
Madame Fortier.
No.
Mr. Bedell.
No.
Monsieur Picard.
No.
Mr. Kent.
Oui.
Monsieur Gourde.
Oui.
Mr. Cullen.
Yes. So the motion has been defeated, 6-3.
That was all six voting Liberal members voting against Trudeau being able to speak to the Ethics Committee. They voted it down. This was a very along party lines vote. Liberals voted against, and the Conservative members who could vote, and I think there's only one NDP member on the committee, they voted for him to speak to the committee and ask questions. So it's clear that Trudeau seems to have a lot of control over his members, because anybody in their right mind would at least have Trudeau come in for questioning. But all the Liberal members voted this down. And even though Trudeau was asked if he would give the ethics committee members a free vote on there, which he pretty much said he did, it's become pretty obvious that voting against what Trudeau wants, voting against the interests of the Prime Minister, will find you out of Parliament pretty damn quick. I actually want to, next time that Trudeau does a cabinet shuffle or something like this, I want to pay closer attention to who he moved out of office, and see if there was some violation or something that they did beforehand. Because I got the feeling we're going to start seeing a lot of that. On top of that, so nothing was done there, and the Liberals decided not to force Trudeau to speak to the commission. On top of that, we ended up finding out that Joshua Boyle, who we may remember from back in October, He ended up getting rescued from Afghanistan. He was being held by, I think it was an Al-Qaeda group, him and his wife, and they had 3 children while they were in captivity. They ended up getting rescued and brought home. And then they had a meeting with the Prime Minister. When it was tweeted out by Joshua Boyle, he left a very cryptic... he was very cryptic where he said that that was not his first meeting with Justin Trudeau, but that was in 2006 over common interests. And it should be worth noting that this is also the ex-husband of Zainab Khader, Omar Khader's sister. And the Khader family has been closely associated with Osama bin Laden. So his whole family ended up meeting the Prime Minister, and then it turned out just before the new year, we found out that he ended up getting arrested for over a dozen different charges that took place between October 15th when he got back and about December 25th, I believe it was. December 30th, 2017. He's being charged with 8 counts of assault, 2 counts of sexual assault, and 2 counts of unlawful confinement. He also faces 1 count each of misleading police to divert suspicion from himself, uttering death threat, and administering a noxious substance, namely trazodone. This has all happened within 2.5 months since he's gotten back. And he's already had a court date. It happened not too long ago, within the last week or two. I haven't really been able to follow the story too much since then, but these are exactly the people who Trudeau has associated with. It just seems that Trudeau has a lot of affiliations with people that have affiliations with extreme radical groups, terrorist groups, and also he seems to be affiliated with a lot of criminals. Even with the Omar Khader case, a lot of people would have respected Justin Trudeau more had he fought it in court, even if they had lost. Because in that situation, he paid out $10.5 million to Omar Khader without fighting him in court over what was human rights violations. And he said he paid it out because they would have lost in court and they would have had to pay a lot more. Well, I don't know if I just speak for myself out there, but I don't believe that he would have won that in court. And second, I also think that many, many Canadians would have preferred that it got fought out in court and lost more, because at least we fought it. At least our government fought for it. And we could respect Trudeau a little bit more. But he just paid him out $10.5 million to a guy who is being alleged, but most likely threw a grenade that killed 1 American medic and injured and blinded another American soldier, at least in one of his eyes. And we didn't fight it. We didn't do anything. He didn't even contact the family of either the widow of the dead American soldier, the medic who died, nor did he contact the Marine who was injured and blinded from the Omar Khader attack. It's pretty obvious that he was there for military reasons. His father and the rest of his family was closely associated with Osama bin Laden, and we all know that they're perfectly willing to put their children forward into soldier positions and send them into battle, because dying for Islam, fighting for, in ISIS case it was the caliphate, but dying fighting for the religion, fighting the infidels, is a great honor in Islam. So I see no reason to believe that Omar Khader wasn't put in that position and wasn't fighting it out with them. But he gets $10.5 million. And this is just another example, because this guy's also associated with the Khaders as well. And what was he doing? He got kidnapped backpacking in Afghanistan something like 5 years ago. What the hell are you doing backpacking in Afghanistan? Is that your holiday? You go backpacking close to where there's a bunch of fucking radical terrorists? Because clearly you were in the area. What were you doing backpacking in Afghanistan? Something about it doesn't sit right with me on that, and that needs to be addressed. And then he's meeting the Prime Minister. It just doesn't seem to stop for Trudeau. It's one thing or another. But Trudeau and the Liberals weren't the only one that faced a little bit of controversy recently. In the new year, the Conservative Party got into a little bit of problems themselves. Andrew Scheer kicked out Senator Lynn Beyak from the Conservative Senate caucus because of comments that she's made in the past, but that part of the reason, but also the main reason was because on her website, she had letters where people were saying, from Indigenous people, that said that apparently their experience in the residential schools weren't as that bad. It gave them some necessary skills. I actually can see people that found that their time in the residential schools were actually beneficial to them. However, I don't believe that this would be a majority group. I think fewer people would. One of the possible reasons they would think this is because if you're in a situation, a really bad situation, if you don't make your own heaven, then you're in hell. So you either really get into it in order to spare your own feelings and your own emotions, or you live in the reality and you live with the abuse that you're being administered. But anyway, that's just one possibility that I think as to why this happened. But when people heard about this, it caused massive backlash, because in the past, Senator Lynn Beyak, even just in 2017 alone, she's had two controversies very similar to this, but her history goes back even farther concerning this. And we have some clips about comments she's made in the past.
Honourable Senators, I rise today to address Inquiry 19 of Senator Kim Pate, the knowledgeable and thoughtful inquiry that she issued here a few weeks ago. I want to present a somewhat different side of the residential school story. Far too many Indigenous people, especially women, are incarcerated in Canada today. And like everyone in this chamber, I seek to find solutions. Today, I will take a broad look at several timely Indigenous issues that are before us. I speak partly for the record, but mostly in memory of the kindly and well-intentioned men and women and their descendants, perhaps some of us here in this chamber, whose remarkable works, good deeds, and historical tales in the residential schools go unacknowledged for the most part and are overshadowed by negative reports. Obviously, the negative issues must be addressed, but it is unfortunate that they are sometimes magnified and considered more newsworthy than the abundance of good. It is because of the less partisan nature of the Senate that we have the ability to look at issues a bit more objectively, to take that second sober look that sometimes gets missed in the theatrics of politics. Honourable colleagues, I want to first acknowledge the excellent work undertaken by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Mistakes were made at residential schools, in many instances horrible mistakes that overshadowed some good things that also happened at those schools.
So that one was back in August, and then we have this one from just this past September 2017. Oh, sorry, the first one was from March, back in March of 2017, and then this one that's coming up is from September of 2017.
Lisa, Senator Beyak posted an open letter on her website advising First Nations people to trade in their Indigenous rights and integrate. Beyak argues none of us are leaving, so let's stop the guilt and blame and find a way to live together and share. Trade your status card for a Canadian citizenship with a fair and negotiated payout to each Indigenous man, woman and child in Canada to settle all the outstanding land claims and treaties and move forward together. Of course, Indigenous Canadians are full Canadian citizens already.
So as you could see, she says that they actually were beneficial, that the history of residential schools, even though there were abuses, is being slandered, and they actually did a lot more good for people. this is a controversy that's gone on a while with her. Before Andrew Scheer became leader of the Conservative Party, the interim leader, Rona Ambrose, who took over after Stephen Harper stepped down, she ended up even having some problems with her. But what was interesting about it is, because it's not a huge deal, I suppose, but even Andrew Scheer got caught up in a bit of exaggeration, if you want to put it that way, as we can see from here.
Conservative leader Andrew Scheer said in a press release that he asked Beyak to remove the messages, but she refused, prompting him to kick her out of the caucus. But now Beyak says that never happened. Contrary to his statement that he asked me to remove the content and I refused, neither I nor my staff ever spoke with Andrew Scheer or anyone from his office at any time.
So, as we saw from that clip, that was Beyak saying that despite the fact Scheer said that he let her go and everything, she never received contact directly. This is because later on Scheer went on to clarify, saying that he ended up contacting her representative in the Senate. It was... she ended up contacting Larry Smith, who has more authority in the Senate. He ended up relaying. He's one of the senior members of the Conservative caucus, and he ended up relaying it back to Beyak that she had been kicked out. And in his statement, Andrew Scheer ended up saying, and this was on January 4th, 2018. On Tuesday, January 2nd, 2018, I learned that Senator Lynn Beyak posted to her parliamentary website approximately 100 letters from Canadians in support of her position on residential schools. While the vast majority of letters focus on the history of residential schools, other letters contained comments about Indigenous Canadians in general. One of these comments stated, quote, "I'm no anthropologist, but it seems very opportunistic culture. Subsistence hunter-gatherers seek to get what they can for no effort. There is always a clash between industrial, organized farming culture that value effort as opposed to a culture that will sit and wait until the government gives them stuff." End quote. First thing I want to say is I think you're wrong when you're comparing that to hunter-gatherers because hunter-gatherers actually had to work pretty hard in order to get their food. And in order to survive, it actually became quite easier to survive when in a farming culture because you didn't have to go out exploring. You didn't always have to move with the food supply. You could have much more abundance of food. So actually the life of a hunter-gatherer is much more difficult, at least in survival means. And again, they say a culture that just sits and waits for the government to give them stuff. Well, it's not exactly a culture that was based around waiting for the authority, the government, to give them stuff. Again, as a hunter-culture gatherer, they had to go out and survive for themselves. Another comment was, quote, "Promoting this comment is offensive and..." Oh, wait, sorry. This is going back to what Scheer said. He said, "Promoting this comment is offensive and unacceptable for a conservative parliamentarian. To suggest that Indigenous Canadians are lazy compared to other Canadians is simply racist. I demand Senator Beyak remove this comment from her website. She refused. As a result of her actions, the Conservative Senate leader Larry Smith and I have removed Senator Lynn Beyak from the Conservative National Caucus. Racism will not be tolerated in the Conservative Caucus or in the Conservative Party of Canada." So this has been the controversy so far, and in terms of even though she's been removed from the Conservative Party, that doesn't mean she's out of the Senate. It just means that she is now an independent senator, because as Canadian the rules go, a senator in Canada can serve until I think it's either 72 or 75. I can't remember which of the two it is, but they can serve till then. So we're stuck with Lynn Beyak in the Senate for now. I don't know if this is something that's going to keep coming back to bite the Conservatives. I think it will because a lot of I think a lot of liberals, the Liberal Party members, are going to try and milk this as much as possible, especially as a deflection from what Trudeau's been going through for a while. It'd be good to then deflect and say, well, here are the Conservatives, how they're fucking up, and we'll probably hear that in question period thrown back at them for a long, long time. The thing is, too, is Andrew Scheer is a lot more limited in what he can do in the Senate compared to what he can do in the House of Commons when in terms of his people. So I don't think it'll be a strong argument, but I think it's going to be one that'll get milked by the Liberals in order to, as a deflection, just another way for them to deflect. Not to be surprised, it's not like they ever answer questions to begin with. Well, I gotta say, everyone, it's good to be back doing this with you, doing it like good full-length episodes, not these little tiny videos that I put out or short cut-down podcasts, but actually be able to sit and do this. It was nice. I want to thank you all for joining me on the podcast today. And in case, I think I may have already mentioned it before, but there's going to be a little bit of a format change just because of school change until I can get my schedule down and know when I'll be free to record more. I'm going to be releasing episodes, I'll be recording full podcasts on the weekends, and then something on about Tuesday, Wednesdays. I'm just going to release sort of what I've been doing more recently. I'll release one episode, like just a video where I cover more in-depth topic. So, but until I can get back on track doing more regular long-term podcasts, that's how I'm going to conduct my channel here on YouTube. So again, thank you for joining me on the podcast today. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is Just My Stupid Opinion. I'll see you all soon.